In the quiet Serbian village of Kisiljevo, the year was 1725. A farmer named Petar Blagojevic had been dead for 10 days, buried properly, mourned deeply. But when neighbors started dying mysteriously one by one, their families whispered a terrifying word that would soon spread across Europe. Vampire. Terrified villagers began reporting night visits from Blagojevic himself, pale, silent, and smelling of decay. The victims would fall ill, gasping for breath, and die within days. When the townsfolk finally gathered the courage to exhume his grave, what they found defied all reason. His body hadn't decomposed. His skin was flush with color. Blood stained his mouth, and his fingernails looked as though they'd grown longer, like claws. The locals screamed, "He's feeding on us from the grave!" So, under the guidance of the local priest, and with full blessing from authorities, they drove a wooden stake through his chest. To their horror, the corpse moaned, and this single event didn't just stay a village legend. It ignited a continent-wide panic, leading to decades of gruesome exhumations, blood-soaked rituals, and a Europe-wide obsession with the undead. Welcome to Nutty Time Tales, where we dig up the weirdest, creepiest, and most disturbing stories from history, quite literally in this case. In this episode, we'll uncover how medieval Europe's fear of vampires turned into real-life horror. From mass graves ripped open in the night, to church-sanctioned vampire hunts, to the strange medical theories that fueled it all. This is the dark, nutty history of the vampire panic, ready to descend into the graveyards of 18th century Europe? Let's dig in. Imagine walking through a medieval European village at night. There's no electric light, just the flicker of torches and the howling wind. The church bell tolls softly in the distance, marking another burial that week. Death isn't a rare event here. It's part of life. Plague, famine, war, and disease meant that nearly every family had buried someone too soon. And when loved ones died unexpectedly or mysteriously, with no explanation available, people looked not to science, but to superstition. Long before Bram Stoker's Dracula, European folklore was already filled with stories of the dead returning to torment the living. But here's the twist. The word vampire itself didn't appear in Western Europe until the early 1700s. Before that, cultures had their own terrifying versions. In Greece, there was the vrikolakas, a corpse that refused to stay buried. In Slavic lands, they spoke of upirs, bloated, red-faced revenants who drank blood or life energy. In Germany, the Nachtzehrer supposedly chewed on its own shroud, and as it did, its living relatives would waste away. These myths had one thing in common: the dead weren't at peace. They were restless, feeding on the living in the most literal and gruesome ways imaginable. The early 18th century was the perfect breeding ground for vampire hysteria. Medical science was primitive. Autopsies were rare. People didn't understand decomposition. So when they dug up a body days or weeks later and found it looking too fresh, they panicked. What they didn't know was that as a corpse decomposes underground, gases cause it to bloat. The skin tightens, forcing blood to ooze from the mouth. Hair and nails appear longer as the flesh recedes. To the untrained eye of a terrified villager, this looked like clear evidence. The corpse had been feeding, and once the church began recording these cases, things escalated fast. Reports poured in from Serbia, Poland, Hungary, and even Austria, all describing undead villagers who returned to claim victims. The word vampire was first used in official European documents around 1725, the same year Petar Blagojevic's case shocked the Austrian Empire. The church ironically helped fuel the frenzy. Priests often led the hunts, blessing exhumations and declaring corpses impure. In some villages, priests ordered bodies to be staked, burned, or decapitated. Others were reburied at crossroads, so their restless souls couldn't find their way home. The vampire panic wasn't just superstition, it was a desperate attempt to control fear in a world that didn't understand death. But soon, that fear would turn methodical. Entire communities would start hunting the dead, with military orders, official paperwork, and autopsies that read more like horror novels. Ready for the next nutty twist? We're about to witness how Europe's first documented vampire hunts began, and the gruesome rituals that followed. Picture this. It's the year 1725. In a small Serbian village under Habsburg rule, The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. A man named Petar Blagojevich has just died suddenly. Nothing strange about that, until, within days, 9 more villagers follow him to the grave, all claiming on their deathbeds that Petar had visited them in the night, pressing on their chests and draining their life away. In a time when death was everywhere, that might sound like superstition. But for the terrified townspeople, this was proof. Petar Blagojevich was a vampire. When Austrian officials arrived to investigate, they didn't dismiss the villagers' story. Instead, they dug up the body. What they found made their blood run cold. Blagojevich's corpse looked too perfect. His skin was pink, his beard had grown, and there was fresh blood around his mouth. The villagers gasped. "He's been feeding!" The Austrian officer on site reported this strange phenomenon in an official document, marking one of the first government records of a vampire case in Europe. The report spread like wildfire through Vienna, the rational capital of an empire now gripped by irrational fear. Following local custom, the villagers drove a wooden stake through Petar's heart, watching in horror as blood spurted from his mouth. Then they burned the body just to be sure. Problem solved? Hardly. The event set off a wave of hysteria across Eastern Europe. Suddenly, vampires were everywhere. Barely a few years later, another Serbian village reported the same horror, this time involving a man named Arnold Paole, a soldier who supposedly turned undead after being bitten by a vampire near Greece. When Paole died, villagers started dying too, again, claiming he'd attacked them in their sleep. The authorities repeated the Blagojevich ritual: exhumation, examination, staking. Once again, the corpses looked fresh, and once again, they were destroyed. What's most bizarre is that these weren't secret village rituals. They were supervised by Austrian military doctors, educated men, writing meticulous reports filled with phrases like corpse bloated with fresh blood and renewed life functions. These reports made their way back to Vienna and Leipzig, where they were published in newspapers, scholarly journals, and even discussed in royal courts. Suddenly, vampire wasn't just a peasant myth. It was a scientific problem. Across Europe, doctors, priests, and even philosophers weighed in. Was vampirism a sign of demonic possession, a medical anomaly, or something in between? By the mid-1700s, the vampire epidemic had reached Austria, Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia, each region performing its own exhumations in broad daylight, often with crowds watching like it was a carnival. Witnesses described bloated corpses that moaned when staked, caused by escaping gases, red liquid dripping from mouths, decomposed fluids mistaken for blood, hearts that still beat due to muscle contraction. Dios. People saw this as undeniable proof. The undead were real. And so, vampire hunts became a blend of religious ceremony and grotesque theater. The living fought the dead, with torches, shovels, and superstition as their weapons. But here's where it gets even darker. These weren't isolated cases of panic. They became community events, spreading from village to village like a plague of paranoia. And soon, Western Europe, the civilized half of the continent, started to notice. Enlightenment thinkers and aristocrats couldn't believe it. Peasants were literally digging up corpses to kill them twice. So, how did the Age of Reason respond to the Age of the Undead? That's what we're diving into next. You'd think that by the 18th century, an age of logic, reason, and powdered wigs, Europe would have left behind stories about blood-sucking corpses. But nope. Instead, the vampire panic spread straight into the halls of science, the salons of philosophers, and even royal courts. Yes, even Voltaire, the great champion of rational thought, had something to say about vampires. After the vampire epidemics in Serbia and Hungary, European newspapers couldn't get enough of the stories. Reports from the Habsburg frontiers described soldiers digging up bodies and villagers performing macabre rituals. The public devoured it. Imagine turning the pages of a prim 18th century Parisian newspaper, sipping tea and seeing headlines like "Dead Man Found Feeding on the Living, Authorities Confirm." Entire village burned corpses to stop undead plague. It was gruesome clickbait centuries before the internet. In cities like Paris, London, and Vienna, vampires became the fashionable fear. Aristocrats debated them at dinner parties. Pamphlets were sold on the streets with illustrations of open graves, fanged corpses, and panicked peasants. Even the Catholic Church got involved. Priests were dispatched to inspect vampire villages, often performing rites of exorcism on decomposing bodies, complete with holy water, incense, and occasionally a hammer and stake. This wasn't fringe stuff, and this was mainstream. As the hysteria grew, scholars stepped in to offer logical explanations, though many of them were just as strange. One German doctor wrote that vampirism might be caused by bad digestion leading to nocturnal suffocation. Another suggested that corpses moved due to trapped gases, and some claimed it was simply Satan's trick, confusing human senses. The French theologian Dom Augustin Calmet, a respected Benedictine monk, even published a 400-page treatise titled Dissertations on the Apparitions of Angels, Demons, and Ghosts, and on the Revenants and Vampires of Hungary, Moravia, and Silesia. That's right. A serious theological scholar wrote one of the first academic vampire studies. Calmet tried to walk a fine line. He didn't say vampires were definitely real, but he didn't deny them either. His conclusion? We cannot entirely reject the testimony of so many credible witnesses. That's Enlightenment logic for, we're not saying vampires are real, but we're also not saying they're not. Even Voltaire, ever the skeptic, mocked the idea in his writings, but not before acknowledging how widespread it had become. He quipped, "Vampires were dead bodies who went out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living." They were common in Poland, Hungary, Silesia, Moravia, Austria, and Lorraine. Voltaire dismissed the superstition as the reflection of fanatic priests and ignorant peasants. But ironically, his description helped immortalize the image of the vampire in popular thought. By trying to debunk it, he accidentally helped spread the myth even further. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church faced a dilemma. If vampires were demons, that meant Satan's power was actively at work in the physical world, a terrifying thought. But if they weren't real, then why were so many holy exhumations yielding proof? So, the church did what institutions often do when caught between logic and panic. It half-believed. Priests performed exorcisms on suspected vampires, blessed graveyards, and instructed locals to bury the dead with rocks in their mouths, to prevent biting after death. Graveyards across Eastern Europe began filling with skeletons bearing strange marks, decapitated heads, stakes through ribs, even limbs rearranged. Forensic archaeologists have found these graves, and the evidence is gruesome. One skeleton unearthed in Poland had a sickle placed across its neck, as if to slice the head off should the corpse rise. Another in Venice had a brick jammed between its jaws, literally a vampire prevention measure. These weren't movie props. These were real people, buried by real families, who truly believed their loved ones might crawl out and drink blood. The irony? All this fear was happening just as Europe was discovering electricity, writing symphonies, and founding modern universities. In other words, science and superstition were dancing together in a graveyard. And while the intellectuals argued, the common people kept digging. Vampire hunts were still raging, fueled by fear, disease, and misunderstanding. But beneath all the madness was something deeper, a desperate attempt to explain what medicine couldn't. Because at the heart of these vampire stories wasn't just blood. It was fear of death itself, and that fear was about to get a terrifying new face. By the 19th century, Europe had supposedly outgrown its obsession with undead corpses. Industrialization was booming. Trains roared, science marched forward, and superstition was something backward people believed in, or so they said. But when tuberculosis, also known as consumption, began ravaging families across Europe and later America, the vampire legend came roaring back from the grave. And this time it wore a doctor's mask. Tuberculosis was a slow, cruel killer. It drained its victims of color, weight, and vitality. People became pale, their eyes sunken, their lips blood-stained from coughing up crimson. They wasted away in bed, and when they died, their bodies sometimes looked eerily alive. In an era before germ theory, this horrifying process had no rational explanation. So when one family member died, and then another soon followed, communities drew their own dark conclusions. The first one isn't really dead, they whispered. They're feeding on the living. Yes, even America wasn't safe from vampire hysteria. Between the late 1700s and late 1800s, New England saw a series of vampire panics, particularly in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Vermont. The most infamous case? The tragic story of Mercy Brown. In 1892, in the sleepy town of Exeter, Rhode Island, the Brown family was struck by consumption. One by one, members of the family died, including Mercy's mother and sister. Then Mercy herself fell ill and passed away in midwinter. But when Mercy's brother Edwin also began wasting away, the townsfolk reached a chilling conclusion. They believed one of the Brown women was feeding on the family from beyond the grave, and so they decided to find out which one. A group of locals gathered in the snow and dug up the Brown graves. The first two, Mercy's mother and sister, were reduced to bones. But when they opened Mercy's coffin, they found her body strangely well preserved. Her hair seemed longer. Her nails looked grown, and when they opened her chest, blood still lingered in her heart and veins. For the villagers, that was all the proof they needed. They believed Mercy Brown was a vampire. Following local superstition, they cut out her heart and burned it on a nearby rock. Then they mixed the ashes into a tonic and made her dying brother drink it, hoping it would cure him. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Edwin died 2 months later. To modern medicine, everything that terrified those villagers was normal. Bodies buried in winter often decompose slowly due to the cold. Hair and nails don't actually grow, the skin just shrinks. And pooled blood in the heart is simply a result of internal decay, not undead feeding. But back then, these signs screamed supernatural. Even worse, doctors themselves were divided. Some believed vampires were a form of contagious hysteria. Others tried to link the disease to bad air, moonlight exposure, or unholy soil. No. One could explain why entire families were dying, and so the vampire became the perfect scapegoat. A mix of folklore and fear disguised as medical reasoning. Newspapers across the country printed lurid headlines, "Vampire discovered in Rhode Island grave." The dead feed upon the living once more. Suddenly, vampire hunts weren't just peasant folklore, they were American reality. Historians believe there were dozens of similar exhumations throughout New England. Graves were opened, hearts burned, and villagers performed rituals that would have fit perfectly in medieval Europe, all in the name of health. Even the famous author Bram Stoker may have drawn inspiration from these cases when writing Dracula in 1897, just 5 years after Mercy Brown's exhumation. The timing is too close, the parallels too eerie. A young woman dies of a mysterious wasting disease. Her grave is opened. Her body seems alive. Blood still in her veins. Sound familiar? It's as if Mercy Brown's tragedy became immortal, not in her small Rhode Island town, but in the pages of Gothic horror forever. And here's the truly nutty part. Even after germ theory proved what really caused tuberculosis, some rural areas continued to perform vampire rituals into the early 1900s. Yes, the age of telegraphs, trains, and photography still had people burning hearts to stop bloodsuckers. Superstition, it seems, doesn't die easily, but that's not where this story ends. Because while vampires haunted graveyards, another terrifying twist was brewing in the medical world itself, one where scientists started experimenting with human corpses to prove or disprove vampirism once and for all. And those experiments? They make the gravediggers look tame. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe's fascination with vampires had spread from peasant fields to university lecture halls. But unlike the fearful villagers who swung shovels and burned hearts, these new vampire hunters came armed with scalpels, notebooks, and a dangerous curiosity. This wasn't just folklore anymore. This was science, or at least a very creepy version of it. During the Enlightenment, educated men wanted to separate superstition from truth. They didn't believe in vampires, or at least they said they didn't. Yet when the reports kept coming, bloated corpses, fresh blood, midnight exhumations, the intellectual elite couldn't resist investigating. In 1732, the Austrian army sent a medical team to the Serbian village of Medveđa. Their mission? To examine the mysterious deaths of several soldiers who claimed to have been attacked by the undead. And what did they find? Bodies that hadn't decomposed, fresh blood in mouths, and limbs that moved when touched. The official report, known as the visum et repertum, described these findings in disturbingly clinical detail and concluded that yes, vampirism might be real. Imagine that. An actual military medical report stamped and filed, acknowledging the undead as a possible cause of death. So much for rational thinking. As panic spread through Eastern Europe, especially in the regions of Serbia, Wallachia and Transylvania, doctors began conducting gruesome autopsies on supposed vampires. In some cases, these were ordered by state authorities, not mobs. Local governors, church leaders, and even the Habsburg military sanctioned exhumations to study the phenomenon. Doctors recorded each finding like a twisted anatomy class. Lungs fully inflated, flesh red and supple, blood still liquid in the heart. Corpse groaned when pierced with stake. Yes, the groaning. Decomposition gases trapped in the chest could cause corpses to sigh or moan when pierced. But to 18th century doctors and peasants alike, it sounded like proof the creature still lived. It's horrifying, but it's also an early glimpse into how superstition evolved into proto-science. They didn't understand bacteria, anaerobic decay, or internal gas pressure. But they were trying to observe, record, and make sense of the madness. Between 1720 and 1780, dozens of official vampire reports circulated across Europe. Some of the most infamous names include Arnold Powell, a Serbian soldier whose supposed vampirism sparked one of the first media frenzies in history. Petar Blagojevic, another villager whose exhumation in 1725 led to 11 other graves being opened. And the aforementioned visum et repertum, which made vampirism sound like a legitimate medical condition. Newspapers from Vienna to Paris covered these cases. Pamphlets were printed with woodcut illustrations of bloated corpses being staked or burned. Experts debated whether vampirism was caused by disease, demonic possession, or soul vapors trapped inside the body. The fascination wasn't just academic, it was entertainment. Audiences couldn't get enough of the macabre details. In a way, it was the 18th century version of true crime podcasts, horrifying yet irresistible. The Catholic Church wasn't thrilled about this undead craze. Priests and theologians feared that digging up bodies and mutilating corpses violated sacred laws. But public panic was stronger than papal authority. Villagers claimed that priests who refused to help were protecting the vampires. Some priests even performed exorcisms and supervised exhumations, just to calm the mobs. Eventually, the Vatican issued vague condemnations, labeling vampire hunts as pagan superstition. But behind closed doors, even church scholars collected reports and debated whether demonic influence could cause pseudo-life after death. So much for divine clarity. Now, brace yourself. This next part could have come straight from a Gothic horror movie. In 1855, a group of physicians in Eastern Europe performed a bizarre experiment on an alleged vampire corpse. According to the notes, they pierced the heart and then connected tubes to measure vital gases escaping the body. When the chest sighed, they claimed to detect movement. Their conclusion? The vampire had died a second death. In another reported case, a doctor in Hungary dissected a corpse believed to be a vampire and preserved the organs in jars of alcohol. He noted with fascination that the heart remained red and warm long after removal. Historians now believe he was simply observing slow tissue decay, but at the time, it was enough to spark fresh hysteria. By the late 1800s, modern medicine finally caught up. Researchers began to understand diseases like tuberculosis, porphyria, and catalepsy, all of which mimicked vampiric symptoms. Pale skin and light sensitivity? Porphyria. Wasting away and coughing blood? Tuberculosis. Appearing dead, then waking up? Cataleptic comas. The explanations were logical, but the beliefs lingered. For centuries, the line between superstition and science had been blurred by fear, ignorance, and fascination with death. Even as medical journals debunked the myth, the image of the undead, rising from the grave to drink the living, refused to die. Because deep down, these scientists weren't just studying bodies, they were studying human terror itself. By the time the 19th century ended, vampire panic had morphed into literature, art, and pop culture. And that's where the legend found its new immortality. Because the next part of our story is where myth meets masterpiece, when fear, folklore, and fiction fuse to create the vampire we know today, ready to step into the candlelit corridors of Gothic horror. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe had seen enough of exhumed corpses and public heart stakings. But fear has a funny way of surviving. It simply changes shape. The peasants' terror of undead neighbors began to fade. But in its place, a new monster emerged, elegant, immortal, and far more dangerous. This was the birth of the literary vampire. From peasant myths to polished monsters, early vampire tales were crude, violent, and rooted in the countryside. They were about dirt, disease, and punishment from beyond the grave, but by the 1800s, the vampire had moved into the salons of London and Vienna, dressed in silk, quoting poetry and seducing aristocrats. The undead had gone high society. In 1819, a young physician named John Polidori, a friend and rival of Lord Byron, published a short story titled The Vampire. It told the story of Lord Ruthven, a mysterious nobleman who preyed on London's elite while maintaining the perfect facade of charm and sophistication. Sound familiar? It should. Ruthven was the direct ancestor of every vampire we know today, from Count Dracula to Edward Cullen. But here's the twist. Polidori's story wasn't meant as horror. It was revenge. He based Lord Ruthven's personality on Byron himself, mocking his arrogance, charisma, and predatory charm. In other words, the world's first vampire story was basically a literary roast, the Gothic obsession. The 19th century was obsessed with death, mourning jewelry made from human hair, post-mortem photography, seances, ghost clubs. Even Queen Victoria kept locks of her husband's hair in a locket. It was a time when death wasn't hidden. It was decorated. So when vampire fiction began circulating through Europe, it fit perfectly into this macabre culture. Magazines printed serialized vampire stories, often featuring doomed women, pale lovers, and moonlit graveyards. The line between eroticism and horror blurred. Readers were both frightened and strangely enchanted. The vampire became a metaphor for forbidden desire, addiction, even disease. By the mid-1800s, one name would push this fascination to its darkest extreme: Carmilla. Carmilla, the forgotten mother of Dracula before Bram Stoker's Dracula ever stalked the page. There was Carmilla, an 1872 novella by Irish writer Sheridan Le Fanu. It told the story of a mysterious female vampire who befriends and slowly drains a young woman in an isolated castle. It was gothic, sensual, and scandalous for its time, hinting at themes of female desire and same-sex attraction wrapped in a blood-soaked fantasy. The imagery of Carmilla, mist-shrouded forests, ancient tombs, hypnotic eyes, would heavily influence what came next. Because only 25 years later, a certain Dublin-born writer would take all those elements and create something immortal. Enter Bram Stoker, the birth of a legend. 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. It wasn't the first vampire story, but it became the definitive one. What made Dracula so revolutionary was how Stoker grounded the supernatural in real-world fears. He mixed Eastern European folklore with Victorian anxieties about disease, immigration, sexuality, and science. He read reports of vampire outbreaks in Serbia and Wallachia, including that same Visum et Repertum document from 1732. In his notes, Stoker even referenced the term Nosferatu, borrowed from regional legends meaning plague carrier. Dracula wasn't just a monster, he was a symbol of everything Victorian society feared but couldn't control. He invaded homes, violated social order, and defied death itself. And like the real vampires of medieval Europe, he was met not with logic but with ritual, garlic, crucifixes, and the ever-trusted wooden stake. The real Count Dracula? Of course, we can't mention Dracula without talking about Vlad III Dracula, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. While Stoker never directly stated that Vlad was his inspiration, the historical parallels are too strong to ignore. Vlad's name, Dracula, literally means son of the dragon, from his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon. And his reputation? Well, let's just say it was bloodthirsty enough to make any vampire blush. He was known for impaling his enemies, thousands of them, on towering wooden stakes, sometimes arranging them in gruesome forests to terrify invaders. Chroniclers described his feasts among the dying, and one claimed he even dipped bread in his victims' blood. Whether that's truth or propaganda, it certainly bled into legend. When Stoker read about Vlad's exploits, he found his monster's name and his eternal myth. The Undead goes Hollywood after Dracula's publication. The vampire transformed again, from a literary villain to a cinematic icon. In 1922, the German silent film Nosferatu reimagined Dracula as a rat-faced ghoul named Count Orlok. So terrifying. The studio was sued for copyright infringement. But the damage was done, audiences were hooked. Then came Bela Lugosi in 1931, suave, hypnotic, wrapped in a black cape and thick accent. His version of Dracula cemented the image we all know today. No longer a bloated corpse from a grave, but a charismatic aristocrat with piercing eyes and a killer smile. From there, the vampire became unstoppable. Hammer films, Anne Rice's interview with the vampire, even Twilight, all of them trace back to one bizarre historical obsession, the fear of death refusing to stay dead. And yet, the fear remains. Even with centuries of science and cinema behind us, the vampire refuses to die. Because deep down, the legend isn't really about monsters. It's about us. Our fear of decay, our obsession with beauty, power, and eternal youth. Our desperate need to believe that something, anything, might live beyond the grave. So the vampire endures, from the muddy churchyards of medieval Europe to glowing Netflix screens today. Always watching, always hungry. Picture this, a moonlit graveyard centuries ago. Villagers with trembling hands clutch stakes, shovels, and torches. They're not murderers, they're believers. They truly think they're protecting their families, saving their souls from something unspeakable crawling beneath the earth. That image sums up the heart of the vampire hysteria. It wasn't just about monsters or corpses. It was about control. When disease, death, and decay swept through medieval Europe, people searched for answers, any answers. And when logic failed, they turned to legend. It's easy to mock them now, to laugh at the idea of digging up blood-drinking corpses. But imagine watching your children die one by one and your neighbors wasting away, with no science to explain it. Wouldn't you start to wonder if something unnatural was at work? The real monsters. The truth is, the vampires weren't the ones in the graves. They were in the minds of the living. Fear itself was the undead force, feeding on rumor, paranoia, and grief. From burned witches to hunted vampires, humanity's darkest moments often come from its brightest emotion, the need to protect what it loves. And that's the most chilling lesson of all. The line between faith and fear is razor thin. History never dies. Every vampire panic, every ghost story, every superstition, they're echoes of the same heartbeat that's been pounding through human history for centuries. A heartbeat that refuses to stop, even when buried beneath layers of reason. Because deep down, we still crave the thrill of the unknown. We still glance over our shoulders when the lights flicker. And part of us, no matter how modern, still fears the whisper of wings outside our window. Maybe that's why the vampire will never truly die. Because it's not just a creature of folklore. It's a reflection of us, of humanity's endless hunger for meaning in the face of death. So, next time you watch a vampire movie or read a gothic novel, remember it all began with terrified peasants digging up corpses in a muddy graveyard, trying to save themselves from a monster that never existed. Or maybe it did. Thanks for watching another Nutty Time Tale, where history proves that truth is always stranger than fiction. If you enjoyed this journey through Europe's undead past, give this video a like, share it with a fellow history lover, and subscribe for more tales of the bizarre, the dark, and the downright unbelievable. Because here on Nutty Time Tales, we don't just tell history, we resurrect it.